Hi, my name is Allison Barnes, and I'm going to be presenting a PowerPoint presentation that I put together outlining real-life negotiation that I participated in and part of the requirements for the Communications Course 411 Negotiation Skills. So here is my PowerPoint, and I will set this up and then go through it with you. Excuse my technical difficulties. Okay. So before kind of going over the negotiation, I thought I would tell you a little bit about my situation. In June, I moved out with my boyfriend. He and I moved in together in order to save money so we can buy a home in the next year. As we live in Seattle, and as I'm sure a lot of people know, rent in Seattle is very expensive. You pay top dollar for not very much space. Usually storage units are extra if they are available at all, and that's something that we decided against signing the lease because we wanted to save the most money possible. When we moved in together, we found out that we have too much stuff and not enough space. So we decided to sell a few of our smaller items to friends and family, the nicer things that we had. We gave away many of the things that we had kind of duplicates of on Craigslist, and we had a lot of success with that. And then 3 items that we had that kind of took up quite a lot of space, the most space, was a mountain bike that my boyfriend had. He actually had won it about 10 years ago in a contest that he's had. He's not super attached to it, but he has liked to use it from time to time, and he had space in his old unit. And then I also had 2 vintage Schwinn bikes that I had inherited from my grandparents that both of us really enjoy. They're these little beach cruisers. We live right by Green Lake, so we like to ride them around in the summertime. And there's one for each of us. So those are 2 things that we really like having. The problem was that we didn't really have any storage space for any of the 3 bikes. So I come up with the idea that we could sell the mountain bike, and that would pay for the additional storage costs to store the other 2 bikes in the storage unit that was offered at the time of signing the lease that we turned down. So in preparing for the negotiation, I did a little self-assessment. I needed to figure out what it was I wanted. I wanted enough money to pay for storing our 2 beach cruiser bikes for the year that we had signed the lease in this unit. My target point was to sell the mountain bike for enough money to cover the cost of storing our other 2 bikes. For the BARNES, I came up with 3 alternatives. My third and worst alternative, I guess, was to sell all 3 of the bikes so that we would have enough room. But the problem with that was that the 2 vintage kind of beach cruisers had sentimental value, and I really didn't want to get rid of those 2 bikes if I didn't have to. My second option I thought of was keeping the bikes in the living room. This is kind of what we were doing up until this point. The only problem with that is if we keep the bikes in the living room, there's no room for a dining room table, and that isn't really something I was too excited about. So my number 1, I think, and best alternative was to store the bike at my parents' garage. They live about 15 minutes away from here, so not very far, but in the summertime, anytime we'd ever want to use them, we'd have to drive down there, pick them up, load them onto the car, drive them back down when we're done. Just kind of more of a hassle, but it certainly wouldn't cost me any money, and I'd be able to keep the 2 bikes. So my reservation point was a total of $120. That amount pays for 1 full year of storage at the new apartment that we have that would store the 2 bikes. Anything else that was out of pocket and I had to pay extra for was worse than my BARNES, which was storing the bikes in my parents' garage. There were no sunk costs. The bike was given to, or like I said, my boyfriend won the bike in a contest. And so we researched the bike. We found similar models, not exact models, selling for just about that price. Some were actually a little bit less. Some of the issues in the negotiation, well, the storage of the 2 bikes that we had, accessing the 2 bikes that we wanted to keep, saving money to buy a home, and knowledge of the product. We didn't know a whole lot about this mountain bike because we hadn't purchased it, and we're not avid bikers by any means. So then it was time to kind of assess the other party. Who was my buyer? Well, I wasn't really sure. I knew that it was going to be somebody that was searching Craigslist for bikes and was interested in buying a bike. The other buyer's issues was my assumption would probably be cost and the bike's condition. My buyer's BARNES, their options are probably to find another bike if they don't want to buy mine. continue to use the current bike they have or go without a bike. They don't already have one. Assessment of the situation. Was it one-time, long-term, repetitive? Well, initially I thought this was going to be a one-time negotiation. That turned out to be different. We'll go over that in a little bit. The negotiation was definitely a little bit of necessity and opportunity. It was necessary for us to store the bikes, and we had the opportunity to sell the mountain bike kind of with 100% profit because we had obtained that bike for free. So this definitely was a transaction and not a dispute. There was a requirement of agreement. Is it legal? Well, yeah, it's legal to sell my bike to somebody who wants to buy it. There was an issue that came up with that later, and we'll get into that. Time constraints and associated costs. There was a little bit of a time constraint. I'd like to have a dining room table sooner than later, but it wasn't, life or death. And there were no associated costs with keeping the bikes here until we sold it or at my parents' garage. The negotiation would most likely take place at my home. So questions and answers with the buyer. So originally after I posted the ad, I got quite a few flaky buyers, people that said they were interested and never showed up. And then about a week later, I finally had a serious buyer. He was emailing me quite a few questions about the year, the make, the model, the different accessories on the bike. He wanted more photographs. He asked a lot about the cost and if I was negotiable on that. Because I didn't know a lot about the bike and I couldn't answer all of his questions, I told him I was more than happy to have him come take a look and we could talk more about costs. When the buyer arrived to my apartment later that evening, just kind of getting to know him and introducing ourselves, I found out we were neighbors. He lives right down the street, one street over actually. He's a full-time student and has a part-time job that he works on the weekends. And then I found out that he just was in a car accident and his car was totaled. And he's currently in the process of saving to buy a new one. So in sharing some of my situation, I let him know that I had just moved to the area and moved in with my boyfriend. We didn't have a lot of space and no storage to keep all the bikes, so we were kind of in the process of figuring out what we were going to do about that. So after the buyer, looked at the bike for quite a bit, he seemed really hesitant about the cost. He wanted to know how low would I go. This is always the part of the negotiation where, I get nervous. I had listed the bike for $150 on Craigslist, and I told him that I, would be willing to go down about $20, down to $130. He didn't really seem like that was comfortable for him. So I kind of started up some more chit-chat and kind of tried to delve in a little bit more what his interests and priorities were. His priority number one was transportation. He didn't have any way around except the bus, and he didn't want to take the bus anymore. He was really interested in using a bike until he had enough money to buy his car. And so he was interested in the lowest cost option to get him kind of by until he had enough to purchase his car. So then I shared some of my interests and priorities. My number one priority really wasn't the amount I would get for the bike. It was storing the other two bikes that I had that were not for sale. My biggest interest was in a storage option that would not cost me anything out of pocket. So kind of through learning of both of our interests and kind of our priorities, I saw potential for a win-win negotiation. So the negotiation contained more than one issue. It was money for the buyer and storage for me, the seller. We also had different preferences. He preferred the lowest cost. I preferred the lowest cost storage option. So thinking outside of the box and chatting a little bit more with him, I started asking him if his apartment offered storage. It did, and it was included in his rent. I asked him if he utilizes the storage, and it turns out he doesn't. He doesn't have a lot of stuff. I asked him if it would fit the other two bikes that were in my living room, and he said it certainly would. I asked him what was the setup. Was it separate from the apartment complex? Is there an option to put like a padlock on it? Is there a separate entrance? It turns out that after he answered these questions, I gave him a new proposal. I asked him if he'd be interested if I were to kind of just give him this mountain bike, if he would trade it in exchange for us to use his storage unit for the next year in our lease. So some of the new issues that came into play now that he seemed interested in this new proposal was a contract. Should I get a contract? This is now a long-term situation, not a one-time negotiation. Were there legality issues? Is it illegal for me to be using a storage unit in a complex that I'm not renting? So I actually ended up walking over this one street over with the buyer to assess the storage unit. It was in a separate building behind his apartment complex. There was plenty of room for our 2 bikes. Not enough for his mountain bike, but he said he would be happy to keep it in his apartment because he didn't have a lot of stuff. So I kind of did some assessment of risk potential. I risked the fact that after buying a car, possibly this guy's going to back out of the verbal contract and tell me that he needs his storage unit back. Are we breaking the law? Is it illegal for me to be keeping things in this storage unit when I don't rent that particular complex? Should we sign a contract? Is it even legally binding? I compared some of these risks to my BATNA, which was storing the 2 bikes at my parents' garage. I always have the option of falling back on my best BATNA. And wintertime's just around the corner. It's not going to be that big of a deal if the bikes are a little bit further from our unit because we won't be riding them as much in the winter. So if he backs out in 2 months, then I felt like no harm, no foul. I felt that in this situation, the risks did not outweigh the alternatives. So I went ahead and went forward. So did I reach a win-win? I mean, at this point, I think I did. So far, things have gone good. Granted, we've only been storing the bikes there for about a month and a half, but we'll see. We only have a couple more months of summer. So if he backs out, I don't feel like it's that big of a deal. We're able to get a dining room table, so I'm happy about that. So after evaluating the negotiation, I think some of my strengths, I definitely utilized my experience with building rapport. And, by talking with this guy and kind of getting to know him and using my people skills, I was able to identify other issues within the negotiation other than just the sale of the bike, which brought us to the deal that we came to. Weaknesses, it was really hard for me to research the other party's BATNA. It was hard for me to try and think of what they would be looking for, other than the obvious of cost and things like that. So I think I could have probably been a little more creative with that. Also a little bit still less confident in pie slicing negotiations and situations where you're negotiating with a boss or somebody that's in a higher power situation than you. I wish I could have thought or found myself in a situation where I could have negotiated in that type of environment, but hopefully my skills that I've picked up from the concepts we've learned this quarter will help in the future with those. And I think what I learned most importantly is that the planning is key. Having the multiple BATNAs and knowing that I had a lot of fallbacks, I didn't have to kind of take the first thing that I got, took a lot of pressure off and enabled me to kind of just talk with this guy and come up with something creative. What I also learned is plans can change. Things aren't always going to go the way that you envision them. And instead of kind of panicking and either, taking the first deal that you can or walking away from the deal, there's really no rush. You can talk with somebody and, again, identify some other issues and see if there's a way to make a deal where you guys can both kind of walk away happy. So that is the end of my presentation and my real-life negotiation. So thank you so much. I'm sorry for the color and the technicality of it all, but I didn't really have the right setup for this. So thanks so much.